Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Susan Apollonio, the Education Programs Director at the American Society of Landscape Architects. And before I introduce my fellow co-presenters, I'd like to just share a couple of housekeeping items. You should see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen a questions box. We will take all of our questions throughout the presentation via that box, and when we get to the end, we will address and answer any questions you have to the best of our ability. Also, on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a notes section. If you wish to take notes during the presentation, they will be automatically emailed to you at the conclusion of the webinar. And with that, I would like to introduce you to my co-presenters. Joining us today are Elizabeth Hebron. She is the Director of State Government Affairs here at ASLA. Joel Albizo is the Executive Director at CLARB, the Council of Landscape Architecture Registration Boards. And also on the line is somebody many of you know very well already, Emily O'Connor, our Education Programs Manager at ASLA. So as a LACIS provider, your organization hosts professional development opportunities that are vital to landscape architects' license maintenance. But do you have a clear understanding of what licensure is and why professional development is so important? And when we surveyed you earlier this year, you indicated that this is something that you'd like to know more about. And so by the end of this webinar, you will have a clear understanding of the important role that you as a LACIS provider organization play in supporting the profession. One common misconception that I hear from both providers and landscape architects is that courses are approved by ASLA for credit. The Landscape Architecture Continuing Education System, or LACIS, is actually a collaboration of several landscape architecture industry groups, including the American Society of Landscape Architects, the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects, the Council of Educators in Landscape Architecture, or CELA, the Council of Landscape Architecture Registration Boards, or CLARB, and the Landscape Architecture Accreditation Board, or LAAB, as well as the Landscape Architecture Foundation. These groups, the six of us, came together to create the system in 2008, and all of the organizations currently manage the system together with volunteer members from each organization serving on LACIS committees. And then ASLA, through Emily and myself, manage the day-to-day operations for LACIS. So what exactly does LACIS do? LACIS was created to establish, maintain, and enforce a set of standards for professional development courses for landscape architects. And there are approximately 16,400 licensed landscape architects in the United States. The standards that were established through the creation of LACIS guidelines and the LACIS program manual, which many of you should already be very familiar, they are maintained through the work of LACIS committees and the day-to-day activity of the LACIS administrator, which I just outlined. They are enforced through the annual monitoring process, which takes place every summer. LACIS acts as a source of quality professional development opportunities for landscape architects. Courses and providers that have been approved have processes in place to monitor the quality of the education that they are offering. And to help ensure the quality of content, only providers that have met LACIS requirements are able to follow LACIS guidelines can submit courses for LACIS credit. And so now that you know a little bit more about the formation and the mission of LACIS, I'm going to hand it off to Elizabeth Hebron to talk a little bit more.
Thank you, Susan. Now, I want to start with talking about answering the question, what is licensure? Technically speaking, licensure is when the government issues a credential that allows a person to practice a regulated profession. It's up to the state, or in some cases the local government, to determine if the profession should be regulated. And the government bases that decision on whether or not the regulation is needed to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. States regulate occupations under the 10th Amendment, which establishes the principle of federalism. Federalism means that the federal government possesses only those powers delegated to it by the United States Constitution, and all the remaining powers are reserved for the states or the people. And with this power, states are able to create laws that require regulation of certain professions. In the case of landscape architecture, 47 states have enacted practice acts, which means that an individual must meet the standards set forth in statute in order to practice and call themselves a landscape architect. 3 other states have what are called title acts, where the individual must meet the requirements in the statute in order to call themselves or use the title of a landscape architect. In addition to the 50 states, licensure is also required in 3 Canadian provinces and in Puerto Rico. We are also working to establish Landscape Architecture Practice Act in the District of Columbia, which, as we say, would complete the last piece of the puzzle. And we've made a lot of progress on this front this year, and we currently have legislation introduced, and it's pending right now before the D.C. City Council. So why is licensure important? As I just alluded to in the last slide, the primary reason licensure is important is that it's designed to keep the public safe from hazards and ensure the public's health, safety, and welfare. Licensure also protects and maximizes the use of natural systems and resources and prevents damage to public or private property from changes in the built environment. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel Albizo, the Executive Director of CLARB, to discuss licensure requirements and the licensing process.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And as you correctly pointed out, licensure is all about protecting the public's health, safety, and welfare, and accordingly, the requirements for licensure are focused on the things that are needed in order to ensure public safety and public protection. There are 3 elements, 3 components to licensure: education, which usually involves a bachelor's or master's degree in landscape architecture. There is a rigorous 4-part examination that is developed and administered by CLARB. Again, it focuses on the elements of practice that directly impact health, safety, and welfare. And then finally, experience. It is generally required to have 2 to 3 years of experience under a licensed landscape architect. So those are basically the 3 requirements for licensure. The process itself is not complicated. In fact, it's quite simple. Typically, one would receive a degree in landscape architecture, bachelor's or master's, and then move on to sitting for the exam. Again, it's 4 parts administered by CLARB, by our organization. Then that individual would work to gain experience, the 2 to 3 years or whatever is required under a licensed landscape architect, and then apply for licensure, which now can be done very easily electronically, in fact. So a little bit about the role of professional development in licensure. This is a very important connection. As of today, 37 states have a continuing education requirement in order to maintain licensure. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but all those states have that requirement. And typically, the licensee is required to attest at the time of renewal that he or she has met those requirements. It's also typical that about 10% of those licensees who renew in any given year are audited. And this is where it's helpful to have documentation. And fortunately, CLARB, working together with ASLA, provides documentation of courses taken. In particular, the focus here is LACES courses. We actually provide documentation of these courses taken within the licensee's council record, which is an electronic record of their education experience and exam history. And what that looks like is something like this. This is actually a fictitious case here, but as you can perhaps see, what you have on this form, on this report, is the course taken, when it was taken. Was it distance learning? Was it an LACES course? Does it cover health, safety, and welfare? And how many credit hours? And these are the fields that this is the information that is really important to licensure boards. Speaking of which, Elizabeth talked about the statute or the law governing licensure. And the licensure is actually administered and enforced, the law, by state licensing boards. And these are made up of licensed landscape architects who are typically appointed by the governor and who volunteer their time to serve the public in this way. boards, what they do is primarily two things. They enforce the law by granting and renewing licenses, and also enforcing the legislation, the Practice Act or the Title Act. And that enforcement typically involves two things. One is investigation of potential violations. So when a citizen or when a member of the public has a complaint about a licensee, that complaint would be submitted to the board. The board would thoroughly investigate it, and then, if necessary, would administer administrative discipline, which again is provided for in the law of that particular state. So that is a quick overview of licensure, how to get licensed, who administers the licensure laws. Now I'd like to toss it back to Elizabeth, who is going to talk a little bit about some of the threats to licensure.
Thank you, Joel. So now that you've heard about why licensure is important and about the process to become and keep your license, as well as more about licensing boards, I wanted to make sure that you understand that not everyone across the country is on the same page when it comes to this idea of licensure. And right now we're operating in an environment that Joel and I like to call the perfect storm, where we have all these kind of forces that you see on the screen in front of you conglomerating to, in some cases, support anti-licensing. So nationwide, there are organized and well-funded efforts to reduce and even eliminate licensure for various professions. Anti-licensing organizations, they've existed for quite some time, but during the last 2 years, they've become better organized and better funded. And these organizations' efforts are gaining ground in some states due to several factors that are depicted on this slide. And starting with the Supreme Court, they had a teeth-whitening ruling back in 2015 that calls into question whether the structures of many types of these licensing boards across the United States meet certain antitrust standards. And additionally, the White House administration issued a report a couple years ago supporting licensing reform, and they've created the first ever federally funded grant program that encourages licensing streamlining. And then we also have numerous state legislatures and governors who perceive licensing as being nothing but a barrier to employment and restricting economic prosperity and growth. So these state legislatures and governors, in some cases, are working to enact legislation to reduce or eliminate the number of licensed professions in their states. And just this past year, landscape architecture licensure came under attack in both Arizona and North Carolina. However, through effective advocacy efforts that included meeting with state legislators, with governor staff, participating in hearings and public meetings and letter writing campaigns, thankfully, ASLA and the chapters and our partners were able to overcome the anti-licensure threats. But we fully anticipate seeing more threats like these emerge in 2017. But then, not to be left out, the U.S. Congress, even though this is a state, really should be a state issue, they're trying to get their hands in the pot. As I said, even though licensing is primarily a state issue, currently there are several bills before the United States Congress that speak to licensure reform. And since this is a state issue, they're trying to get it through using the military as an example. And there are bills out there to try and ease reciprocity for those in the military and streamline or eliminate licensing requirements for those in the military or those working on military bases. And there is also another component of one of these bills that would try and reform licensing in the District of Columbia, since technically the federal government oversees the District of Columbia, and they would like to use this as a model for other states to adopt. So at ASLA National, we are closely monitoring all developments related to licensure. We're also working with our chapters to develop education and advocacy pieces showing the importance of landscape architecture and the impact on public health, safety, and welfare, and working closely with our chapters to improve their their current legislation, and, of course, trying to defeat any attacks on landscape architecture licensing. And now I'm going to turn it over to Emily O'Connor to discuss licensure and the role of continuing education.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So I'm going to tell you all about how all of this information relates back to you providers. Joel touched upon professional development a little earlier in the presentation, but I'm just going to get into a little bit more detail in what role professional development plays in licensure and license maintenance. So just a quick note, we here at LACIS use professional development as a term to describe the courses that the landscape architects need to take for license maintenance. That term professional development is synonymous with continuing education. So don't be confused on those two different terms. So as Joel mentioned earlier, there are currently 37 states and 3 Canadian provinces that require licensed landscape architects to complete continuing education in order to maintain their license. This requirement's in place to ensure that practicing landscape architects stay up to date on vital information that allows them to protect the public health, safety, and welfare through the work that they do. So the map here on the slide shows a breakdown of states that have a continuing education requirement and which states accept LACIS-approved courses. Unfortunately, each state has a slightly different set of rules for license maintenance. However, the guidelines that LACIS established for continuing education providers and the content that they develop are rigorous enough to be accepted by the majority of states that have a continuing education requirement. You'll see on the map that 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces, which aren't pictured here, will automatically accept LACIS-approved courses for their continuing education requirement. So if your organization happens to be in a state that does not have a continuing education requirement or does not accept LACIS courses, don't worry, your education content is still valuable. Many landscape architects are actually licensed in multiple states, so they can make use of the courses that you offer to maintain those other licenses. As we heard from Joel, state licensing boards regularly audit 10% of their licensees to ensure that they're meeting the continuing education requirement. And this is much the same way that LACIS monitors providers to ensure that they're meeting the established guidelines that we've developed. So this is why so much emphasis is placed on providers supplying certificates of completion, reporting attendance, and keeping accurate records. The transcript that Joel showed you earlier in this presentation is populated partially by the attendance list that you providers upload into the LACIS system. Landscape architects rely on the documentation that you provide to them and to us to prove to their state licensing boards that they've fulfilled their continuing education requirement and so that they can continue to practice. So we recently added more resources to the tools page, which is shown here on your screen. These new resources provide information about the continuing education requirements for landscape architects. So if you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you all to check out these new resources. There you can see what the requirements are for landscape architects in your area, so you can have a better understanding of what their educational needs are. So that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation today. We wanted to leave ample time for you all to ask any questions that you might have. I know that we relayed a lot of information, so please feel free to use that question box at the bottom left side of your screen to submit any questions that you might have. We've also recorded the webinar today, so if you'd like to share with your colleagues or direct anyone or possibly review this presentation, I don't know, in your spare time, that's going to be posted to the tools page as well in the next couple of days.
So this is Susan. I've just come back on. It doesn't look like we have any questions at this point. That was a lot of information, so maybe you're still processing. You are always welcome to reach out to Emily and I directly if anything comes up. But if you have anything that maybe Elizabeth or Joel can speak to, they're a fabulous resource. So if you have anything, we can always pass it on to them if you don't submit it now. I hope we've helped demonstrate to you just how important the work that you are doing in support of professional development is. And I also want to say thank you for continuing to be an active LACIS provider and to provide this really valuable service. Here we go. Stephanie McShane has asked if there is a presentation for LACIS providers to assist them in requirements for registering courses. And yes, there is. When you log into the tools page, there are step-by-step instructions for completing that process. And then Ellen Sakamoto has asked, what lobbying efforts is ASLA taking to keep required licensure by states? And that is a great question for Elizabeth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ellen, for your question. As I had talked about, we've seen several states recently come under attack, and we are working very closely with the chapters to help them respond to their attacks and to work with their lobbyists to help them respond to their attacks. We have a system called the iAdvocate system, and we're trying to engage chapters to utilize the system. In Arizona, we were able to, through the iAdvocate system, have over 1,500 letters sent to the Arizona governor and the Arizona state legislature, which we heard made a huge impact, and work with the chapters to have nearly 200 representatives, landscape architecture representatives at the hearing on the landscape architecture elimination bill. And that made a huge difference there. And as well as similar activities assisting the North Carolina chapter. We're also just keeping our eyes open nationwide so we can be on top of any threats and maybe pursue or encourage people not to, or I should say educate people in order that they don't introduce legislation deregulating the profession.
I'm going to read one more question that came in, which is what law ruled on by the Supreme Court to bring into question state-by-state licensure? Joel, you've got a lot of experience with this one. Do you want to take on this one?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Ellen. I think it was in December of 2015. It was about a year ago that the Supreme Court ruled on a case in North Carolina. I think Elizabeth talked about it. And the issue really revolved around antitrust liability for state boards. And what it really said is that state boards are not necessarily exempt from antitrust liability. That was a very profound statement because there is this state action doctrine. There is this law that essentially holds that actions by states are immune from antitrust. And what this ruling said is that boards aren't necessarily state entities all the time, and so that they could be liable for antitrust. So what that has done is that has raised a lot of questions among the individual states and their own legal advisors, starting with the Attorney General, to try to figure out what sort of level of supervision needs to happen of boards so that they are exempt from antitrust. And as you may know, when the Supreme Court issues rulings, there's a lot of legal philosophy and a lot of legal language, but there isn't a great deal of specificity about how to implement those laws. They're very broad. So we're still in a period where states are figuring this out. I think how this relates to state-by-state licensure, a threat to licensure, is that I think some jurisdictions are taking a more aggressive approach to defining as supervision, and that is creating some stress within boards and within and of their ability to regulate effectively. And there, as Elizabeth suggested, there are some folks out there who are not big fans of regulation, who see the Supreme Court ruling as a way to sort of further antagonize against regulation. So I'm sorry for the long-winded explanation, but it just has added a lot of complexity to the environment. And I go back to the analogy that Elizabeth and I like to use, is that perfect storm analogy. So this is what we're sort of wading through. But again, I want to say that ASLA does a magnificent job of marshaling supporters of licensure and have been very effective so far, and we do what we can as well.
Thanks, Joel. And this is Elizabeth. Just to add to that, Ellen, if you're looking for the name of the case, it was the North Carolina Dental Board versus the Federal Trade Commission.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Joel. I have one more question that is unrelated specifically to licensure, but is probably a question that any provider on the phone may have, and that is, what is the typical time frame required for initial submission to approve courses under LACIS, especially in regards to planning a multi-day conference in 2017? And Emily is going to address that for you.
Thanks for the question. So the typical time frame to approve a course that's been submitted to LACIS for continuing education credit, we generally try and get them approved in about a week. We recently added additional staff to do course review in order to actually get through the courses in a timely enough manner to meet the provider's needs. It also partially depends upon the time of year and kind of what else is going on in the office, because the staff here that administer at LACIS are also ASLA staff, and it's the annual meeting time for ASLA, which is actually coming up next week. There can be a bit more of a lag on those courses. If there's any sort of rush, or if you're coming up with a print deadline, you can always feel free to send us an email just alerting us to the fact that courses have been submitted. That can be sent to lacis@asla.org. I'm always happy to, take a quick look at what you've submitted.
Thanks, Emily. And I would just add to that one thing that comes up a lot when we monitor providers is that we ask, part of the guidelines is that courses are supposed to be submitted for approval before they are offered. So if you have a conference planning, too soon is never too soon for review. We are coming up on time. I see if your question was not answered live on the webinar, we will follow up with you directly to get into the details of your question. And again, I want to thank Joel from CLARB, Elizabeth. We really appreciate all the knowledge that you just shared, and especially we want to thank all of our providers for all the great work that you do. And this will be posted to the tools page, and we will give you a slide deck as well. And we hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for your time.